God Wars Future Past is a strategy RPG that pays homage to many of Yasumi Matsuno's games, such as Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics, with a dash of Jeanne D'Arc's presentation style. It's based on ancient Japanese folklore and features grid-based battles, a job system, a boring plot, a golden drill top, and photorealistic cloud graphics. The story begins with Queen Tsukuyomi offering her daughter Sakuya to Mount Fuji in order to appease the god's anger and prevent Mount Fuji from erupting. Fast forward 13 years later, and the protagonist, Princess Kaguya and daughter of Lady Tsukuyomi, is freed from imprisonment and sets off on a pilgrimage to find her mother who has gone missing. God Wars' plot could work, but is devoid of any character development, pitifully written dialogue.
You're right! Tsukuyomi went to go stop it!
No! She went to go stop it!
And lazily plotted scenario. It's so poor that I was actually confused as to who the protagonist was at the start of the game. After the first chapter of the game, you would think it was Kintaro, but after a few chapters, the game prevents you from taking Kaguya out of the party, leading me to believe that she was in fact the protagonist. If it takes gameplay mechanics for me to figure out who the protagonist is, you've kind of failed. What pains me the most is that there was actual material that they could have worked with. The protagonist was imprisoned for 13 years. What happened during those years? How was she treated? How did she feel during that time? She must have been a child when she was first put in prison. By that logic, she shouldn't know almost anything about the world that she lives in and struggle to socialize, but evidently she is completely fine. This is ripe material for an intriguing plot. The story could have been much more than a search for her mother. It could have also been a search to find herself in a world that she was completely shut off from. Most of the cutscenes in God Wars begin with a minute of dialogue and then shoehorns the next location and rinse and repeat.
Alright, let's go to Suwa to see Sister Iwanaga.
Looks like we've found our next destination.
If they weren't going to spend much time developing the characters, then honestly the story might have been better served through narration and only show the portions of the story that are relevant. Needless to say, I pretty much tuned the story out after the first few hours of the game, and even then I was still able to predict the majority of the plot.
It's not scary! It's scary! It's scary!
What the heck was that?
God Wars was released on both the Vita and PS4. It's pretty apparent that, graphically speaking, the Vita's hardware was the target. However, even for the Vita, the graphics are underwhelming. Considering the fact that this game's graphics are poor, you would think that the art style would be interesting, but there isn't even really anything noteworthy other than the fact that it uses ancient Japanese imagery. In that case, the game must be cheap. Well, depends on your definition. For the PS4, it costs $50, and for the Vita, it costs $40, so it's $10 cheaper than a AAA title. Take that as you will. The animations are also uninspired. They get the job done, but they're generic and lack creativity. God Wars does very little to excite the player in this regard, nor does it use animations as an opportunity to further drive a character's personality. The one good thing is that you can turn the animations off to help speed up combat, which is advisable since they're boring to watch and battles can be lengthy. God Wars surprisingly features English voice acting, and it's better than I would have expected from a game like this.
Calm down. We're in the palace of the Saga Nation. Lady Tamayori is coming.
Though it's far from excellent, but it gets the job done. However, if you don't like the English dub, you can choose to listen to the Japanese voice track instead.
久しぶりだね、ミコ。さっきは助かった。あいつらは最近この辺りを荒らし回ってる族でね。
The one notable thing about the English voice track is the volume. The default setting is so low that the character dialogue can be impossible to hear the majority of the time.
Yes, it's much sturdier than stone. Metal is found in mountains or stones. People dig it up and repurpose it for their own convenience.
The Japanese audio, however, was recorded at the proper volume and can be heard fine at the default setting. The voice volume setting can be modified in the options, and increasing it to the max helped considerably. But even at the max volume, there are still lines like this.
You must still type is... What is wrong?
You would think that because God Wars is based on ancient Japanese folklore, that the soundtrack would primarily feature ancient Japanese instruments. Well, it does, but not as much as it should. Instead, it sticks to more traditional orchestration that you normally hear in every other strategy RPG. There's nothing terrible about the composition of the tracks themselves, however, there is very little variation in the tracks that are played. There are only a few different battle tracks in the game, and most of the variation comes towards the end of the game. So, for the most part, you're going to hear the same exact battle song for every battle in the game. Needless to say, it gets really repetitive. God Wars features a grid-based battle system akin to Final Fantasy Tactics. Like Final Fantasy Tactics, it pools everyone, allies and foes alike, and chooses a turn order based on their agility. However, unlike Final Fantasy Tactics, a character's turn can only come around once before recycling the turn order. Except some bosses who can go twice, and the final boss that gets 3 turns. During a character's turn, you can move the character's position, attack foes, buff allies, cast magic spells, and all of the usual things that you would come to expect out of a strategy RPG. It's pretty standard fare, and doesn't do anything particularly revolutionary here. There is one mechanic that does stand out a bit, which is known as impurity. Each character gains impurity based on how effective they are in combat. The higher the impurity, the more likely they are to be targeted by enemies. This is very similar to mechanics often found in MMORPGs. It's something that, when the game first introduced it, I didn't think it would be something that would really be utilized. But surprisingly it was, and I found myself dedicating a character to be the party's tank, and can honestly say that without doing so, I don't think I would have survived the vast majority of the game. It's a mechanic that fits so naturally in a strategy RPG that it makes me wonder why no other game I've played in the genre has implemented this. Battles in God Wars can be long. I fought battles that have taken 10 minutes, but the further you get in the game, the more often they're going to take a half hour or 45 minutes. And every so often you'll get into a fight that will take a couple of hours. Then there's the final boss fight, that took me somewhere around 7 or 8 hours. Yeah, I had to leave the game on overnight for that one. Unlike a franchise like Fire Emblem, the battles won't always feel progressive. There are times where you'll be going back and forth with the enemy for what feels like an eternity, hoping to accomplish one small goal. In order to survive many fights, it's almost imperative to buff up your characters, so a lot of turns are going to be reapplying buffs rather than killing target after target. However, this method of design more accurately reflects war, as war can often be a back and forth process. Whether this is a positive or negative aspect of the game will depend on personal preference, but if I had to wager a guess, most people will probably hate it considering the fact that we live in an age where everybody and their mother has ADD. However, even if you see this as a positive, there are still certain battles that are inexcusably designed so that you'll just spend turn after turn moving your units, buffing and rebuffing your characters in the process until you finally reach the next section of enemies. I consider myself a fairly patient person, and it made even me very impatient. One of the highlights of God Wars is the progression system. Like many strategy RPGs, it features a job system. Each character has a main job, a sub-job, and a unique job, and each job has its own skill tree for learning and upgrading abilities and traits. Your main job determines the character's stats, equipment, and abilities. Sub-jobs can be used to gain extra abilities and traits, and a unique job is unique to each character and cannot be changed. Unique jobs come with their own specific abilities and traits. Each character can start out as either a warrior, priest, or magician. Leveling up your job can then allow the character to branch out into more advanced jobs. There is nothing revolutionary about this system, but it is well executed, and while it doesn't have the level of variety as Final Fantasy Tactics and many other strategy RPGs, it still has enough to warrant mixing and matching jobs with sub-jobs and provides purpose to fighting battles and leveling up your characters. It's refreshing to see a game go back to the basics rather than try to implement an overly complex system.
She looks gorgeous from behind, too.
Fascinating.
God Wars is a tough game to recommend. There are numerous flaws: the awful characters and story, repetitive soundtrack, outdated visuals, $50 price tag, and to make matters even worse, the game has even crashed on me numerous times while playing. It feels like a game made by professionals, but without any passion. However, if all you're looking for is a new game that plays a lot like Final Fantasy Tactics and don't care at all about story, then you'll find that here, and you may enjoy it. If you have some patience, of course.